you so much for coming to my talk. My name is Julia Sebastien, and I am a researcher at York University. My email is below if you have any questions at all. So let's get started without any further ado. So in case you haven't heard about this case, on March 13th in 1964, Kitty Genovese was raped and murdered largely in plain view of her Queens apartment. Reportedly, 37 or so citizens witnessed this highly visible, audible, and preventable horror from their apartment room windows, and they did absolutely nothing but watch. So when psychologists scrambled to make sense of what possibly could have happened, researchers Darley and Latané in 1968 provided one explanation that has really caught on: a diffusion of responsibility. So what is this concept? Well, according to Darley and Latané, a diffusion of responsibility occurs when the presence of multiple bystanders at a scene reduces the perceived responsibility that each bystander feels to take action. This is theorized to occur not simply because the witnesses are apathetic or indifferent, but rather because each witness assumes that the others will surely act. So if responsibility, or at least perceived responsibility, could be theorized of as maybe a pie or a pizza, the more people that are around, the smaller each person's slice of that pizza is, which makes the perceived responsibility that any one witness feels smaller and smaller as more people are at the scene. So to support this hypothesis, Darley and Latané conducted a series of experiments in which a participant was either alone or in a group when some sort of staged crisis occurred, whether it be a man passed out on the street or otherwise. The results from these studies demonstrated that as the number of witnesses to a staged crisis increased, many of these were Confederates who were told to act as though nothing was happening, the longer it took for any one person to intervene, if they did at all. If, for argument's sake, responsibility can be thought of as, say, something that could be shared, then despite the fact that adding all these slices together would still equal a whole, because no individual witness felt that whole, none of them acted, even when none of them were Confederates. So this so-called bystander effect, or also called bystander apathy, it was found especially to be the case when the danger of the crisis was kind of ambiguous. So as you can see here, the people in this cartoon are sort of rationalizing different explanations for what the man on the ground could be doing or why he might be there. And that's really interesting because each of these thoughts are uninvestigated assumptions that essentially write off their responsibility to act and ultimately lead to this man who potentially might be in danger not receiving help. I'm sure this or something similar might have come across some of your radars while you've been walking around. And we're sort of trained to not get involved in other people's business, to respect people's privacy, and also we generally tend to be hurrying around about our day, which is another factor that follow-up studies have shown to be correlated with not intervening when someone may or may not be in danger. Again, ambiguity is a key term here. So despite the dominance, though, of Darley and Latané's theory, which, as I've said before, has been supported by numerous other studies that stage similarly ambiguous but risky crises, the rational assumption that another witness would surely take action, so each individual witness didn't, seems to be a bit of an ill-fitting explanation for how 37 people could passively witness a brutal crime for half an hour while ignoring Genovese's cries for help. And how could they still assume that someone was clearly on their way any moment when for 30 minutes no one was and no one has? Even though a lot of these elements seem to align with the follow-up studies that were conducted, the specifics of this case don't really seem to line up with being able to make a cognitive and rational assumption that wouldn't then be immediately disproven. So shouldn't it have been clear by then that no one was coming to help in their place? This presentation is sort of positing that rather than maintain that everyone had this rational and absurd assumption and that they were able to hold on to it without doubt for 30 minutes, let's consider something maybe more plausible, that the bystander effect occurs most when the crisis and the danger of the situation is ambiguous. Let's focus on that finding. But if it was obvious that no one was on their way to get help, then rather than diffusion of responsibility, perhaps some aspect of the reality of the dangerous situation then was unclear. But what about this situation might have been ambiguous? Well, let's zoom out a bit to this cartoon because it might actually give us a clue. If you look at panels 1 and 2 here, this whole animation put together is actually suggesting, which is very similar to what this presentation is suggesting, is that paradoxically, perhaps the very fact that no one seemed to be running for help may have actually played a role in convincing bystanders that the danger of this event wasn't actually real, or that what they were perceiving, as in the reality of the situation, wasn't correct. So the technical terms to describe the factors involved in this process, I'll get into them in more detail, but they are the freeze response, derealization, and some form of reality testing, which is done by looking to others for a form of social learning. I'm arguing that a combination of these factors created ambiguity in the situation, which both incited and prolonged each witness's inaction, rather than the popular but unrealistic assumption that someone else would intervene. So we have a long history of learning about social learning. It was popularly coined by Albert Bandura. And this phenomenon of us learning how the world works or what dangers there may be in the world from others has its roots in evolution. And there are many studies that have supported this and given examples in a laboratory setting. So these studies show that when we are unsure about our surroundings, or when we're babies and just learning about them for the first time, even if these surroundings may be potentially dangerous to us or others, we look to others for confirmation before we act and before we necessarily trust that our perception of our surroundings and the dangers therein are actually accurate. This is evolutionary adaptive, and this is how we make sense of the world. So in this famous example on the left, Gibson and Waugh in 1960 watched as an infant gauged the danger of crawling across a very safe glass plane that basically created the effect of a visual cliff. And this infant would be looking at their mother's facial expression across the other side of the chasm and gauging the safety of this visual cliff based on their mother's expression. And in this study, it was found that when babies saw fear on their mother's faces, they became very apprehensive about crossing the glass cliff, the visual cliff, the glass plane, and they perceived it as a danger. But when the mother was happy and seemed secure, as we can see in this image, the infant wasn't scared at all crossing the visual cliff. That's just another example of social learning, learning from a cue what dangers there are in the world. You can see that this has, huge evolutionary adaptiveness. In this other famous example in the middle, first done by Darley and Latané, a room filled with smoke while participants took a written exam. The number of Confederates in the room, so paid actors, let's say, was varied, and it was found that when the participant was alone when the smoke was piped through the room, it was harmless smoke, the participant reported the smoke to the experimenter to leave the room and save themselves almost immediately. But when there were Confederates present who didn't visibly react to the smoke, the participant took much longer, sometimes 10 or even 20 minutes to say anything, as though the presence of others who didn't seem perturbed by the dangers actually caused the participant to doubt the dangerousness of the smoke, or even the reality of their perceived danger. In another study on the right, or symbolized on the right, by Stove in 1974, a Hungarian Holocaust survivor and altruism researcher, a study participant and a Confederate were placed in a room together, and they were instructed to work on a task together. They would then hear a crash from the next door room, and they'd hear cries of distress. When the Confederate in the room said something dismissive of the danger, like, "Oh, it's probably nothing, it's probably just another experiment next door," only a quarter of the actual participants went over to check and potentially intervene in a dangerous situation to help someone who might be in distress. But when the Confederate said anything along the lines of, "That didn't sound good," suddenly participants' perceptions that someone might be in danger were validated, and the proportion of participants who went over to intervene increased to 2/3. And then when the Confederate said something like, "Maybe we should go in to check," 100% of participants went to the next room. So these are really, really critical examples of how cues from others can help us really get a sense of whether the dangers that we're perceiving are real or not, and these can have huge, huge consequences for whether or not we take action. So it's very possible that if we relate this back to the Kitty Genovese case, perhaps the lack of cues from others influenced Genovese's witnesses to doubt their own perceptions of the danger she might have been in, which then would have prolonged their doubts and then their subsequent inaction. But what might have caused it to begin with, before the reality testing began, before people looked to others to perceive the reality of their situation, where might witnesses' doubt have come from? I posit to you that it was the freeze response. So what if, rather than a diffusion of responsibility, which, as we've covered before, is sort of feeling less responsible oneself because others are present, and making somewhat of a rational assumption that someone else will surely come, what if witnesses' immobility and transfixed immobilization resulted from the primitive freeze response, which is also characterized as a tie between two well-known primal reflexes to danger, fight and flight? Rather than an approach or an avoidance motivation like fight or flight, the freeze response is often characterized as a stalemate between the two, which results in accelerated heart rate and tonic immobility. It is triggered by the primitive hindbrain, which is associated with our evolutionarily ancient reflexes that are outside of our cognitive control. So animals, like a deer in headlights, can also definitely freeze, but people also have been found to enter a state of freeze while experiencing trauma or when shocked, as very well might have Genovese's witnesses. Research by Graziano and Habashi in 2010 and 2015 support that in an emergency, both the evolutionarily preserved fight and flight mechanisms are activated simultaneously, which both inhibit and motivate helping behavior, but overall tends to inhibit in this stalemate. These findings and other scholars' findings support that people's pro-social or apathetic reactions to a crisis are actually reflexive, rather than a conscious decision to help or not to help, or rationalizing that someone is on their way. In fact, freeze presents actually a much better explanation for what Kitty's witnesses were experiencing while literally watching the murder than does Darley and Latané's theory about witnesses' rational assumptions. Critically, unlike in all of Darley and Latané's experiments, which tested the diffusion of responsibility, these apartment dwellers, for the most part, were looking out their windows from private rooms. They couldn't actually see or interact with each other to A, come up with that sense of shared non-responsibility, and B, to confirm whether anyone had sent for help, and C, equally critically, as we've said before, to even confirm if their perception of the danger was real. And this becomes especially important because of certain facets of the freeze response. When the freeze response takes hold, it's actually often accompanied by subjective experiences of derealization and sometimes depersonalization, especially if the experience is traumatic. These experiences involve the person feeling detached from reality, in a state of confusion or detached uncertainty about the accuracy of their perceptions and the reality of their surroundings and their own place in them. And you can imagine how a derealized person wouldn't necessarily perceive a dangerous situation as truly dangerous, and they might also lose their sense of embodiment at the scene, which as a bystander could absolutely lead to prolonged inaction and a very long delay before a bystander would feel as though they even have a corporeal role to play in the events that are unfolding. And if you're not convinced yet, the description of the experience of being derealized is often likened to looking at the world through a window. This is the precise experience that Genovese's witnesses were having. So this sense of suspended reality, due to a freeze response, which again is reflexive, it's something we can't control. It's a simultaneous activation of approach and inhibition. This could absolutely lead Kitty's witnesses to doubt their perceptions about the dangers of what was going on, and this would lead to prolonged bystander inaction. So if we want to look at this as sort of a process between one's actions and our cognitions and our affect, this is sort of a model that I have put together to try to explain the processes that I'm talking about. The cognition and affect are on the right, and the feelings and thoughts that a bystander might be having are both products of and contributors to the actions on the left, which we might perceive as tonic immobility, but could more precisely be broken down into 3 steps: a freeze response, a stage of reality testing or looking to others, or maybe in the case of Genovese's witnesses, gauging whether hypothesized others, the implied others that may be present, are acting, and then prolonged inaction. So what about the diffusion of responsibility? Well, Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance tells us that when we feel tension because our public actions are at odds with our private beliefs, we actually tend to adjust our private belief to align it with our actions, to ease any sort of tension with as little embarrassment as possible, to save face. While the assumption that someone else would surely intervene seems unlikely to have single-handedly eased all the witnesses' minds for the entire half-hour duration of the murder, it is still possible that something like this might have come up as a way for witnesses to rationalize retroactively their actions, to ease any tension or cognitive dissonance that might have arisen from confronting the lethal consequences and subsequent immorality of their inaction. As you can see here, there's a state of dissonance, tension, when our actions don't align with our beliefs, and what ends up changing is our private beliefs. So in this case, although this might not have been the thought that witnesses had at the time, something like this absolutely could have been part of how they made peace with their inactions, both within themselves and to the press and to the inquiring public, because this event was somewhat of a phenomenon, and it would be quite embarrassing to admit to the public that you perceived something as a danger, but did nothing. So let's return one more time to that diagram, because I want to add one more thing for you to think about. If at any point someone might have snapped out of this state of freeze long enough to consider that their actions might have lethal consequences, if their actions are resulting in a real danger, if their perception of the non-reality of the danger turns out not to be correct, and in that moment of lucidity, one could imagine that a witness would feel intense dissonance from their window. And I posit that this state of tension, if we've learned anything from Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, would result in a change of mind rather than a change of action. So if at any point a witness's inaction causes tension while Kitty still might have been saved, it is far more likely that the inaction would have been further perpetuated by a rational assumption that would have put these worries to rest. So in this case, it could be a diffusion of responsibility, which I'm sort of using as a coverall term to include making and insisting upon some sort of rational assumption that someone might arrive. So while this might not be the cause of inaction, as Darley and Latané posited, I think it definitely might play a role in perpetuating a cycle of inaction once some degree of inaction due to this freeze response has already gotten set into motion. So given that the cycle can have fatal consequences, whether you're in your home, at the pool when a crisis occurs, or in an elementary schoolyard, Darley and Latané's bystander intervention model is really critical and should definitely be learned in order to understand how bystanders can be spurred into action and what can go wrong at each step between an emergency occurring and a bystander feeling able, competent, and responsible to intervene and offer assistance. Here's a shorter version of just the steps that can go right. And with obvious reasons, something like this can and should and has been used to train people to become perceivers of potential dangers, people who feel responsible for their surroundings, and people who feel personally responsible and empowered to take responsibility in moments of crisis. These types of initiatives are especially successful in lifeguard training because people are taught the signs of dangers early. And when you adopt that kind of mindset where you're constantly scanning for danger and you're told enough stories of what happens if these early warning signs are overlooked, these training programs create people who are proactive because they might have some sort of badge or identification with a life-saving identity. So they already feel personally responsible. in theory, they've received training of how to provide help, so they feel competent and knowledgeable about the kind of help to provide. And they're also knowledgeable about what potential dangers might be spiraling from a potential warning sign. So they're also able to spot danger in a situation. Interestingly, I was a certified lifeguard, and one of the things that I learned during my training is that when I'm acting as a first responder for someone in need of help, if I'm interested in getting someone else's help, say to call 911 or to do a side task for me to help as a bystander, that it's really unwise to simply call into the void, somebody please help, this person needs help. Because it's far more common for people to be in a state of shock and inaction. And although it wasn't a psychology degree, we were trained to actually get a bystander to help us by singling them out, by pointing out an item of their clothing, or by calling them by name if we know their name. But if you're at a public pool or a beach or something like that, you'd say, hey, you in the red shirt, can you please call 911? And by doing that, by naming something about their clothing, psychologically what's happening is you are bringing them back into their self from a state of shock, from a state of not feeling physically embodied in this scene as an agent capable of action and having a physical impact on the scene that's unfolding. So I think that's really, really helpful and relevant to think about as we're talking about bystander apathy, which is really more bystander derealization. And the important thing is to learn how to bring people back into themselves to spur them to action. And training can definitely be one way of creating active bystanders. Another way of creating active bystanders is by hosting training programs for the general public, whether it's CPR or just general spotting a problem and acting on it. So Irvin Staub, if you remember from the Hearing a Noise Next Door study, is a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who is very motivated to research altruistic behavior and runs active bystander training for both civilians and police. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I definitely recommend that you research his work because it's really astounding. And I think that more training like his could result in, not just lifeguards, but better people, better citizens. And thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much for the very interesting and probably life-saving talk. So just to let you know, the next speaker, Lydia Kastner, she can't make it to her talk. So we have now approximately 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any question, please raise your hand. Yes, I will ask people to pose question here first, and then we can go to the Google document. So I see Peter Juan raising his hand. You can unmute yourself now.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I posted my question in the Google document as you were talking, but I'll change a little bit. I think this is really awesome and fantastic to talk about the derealization as opposed to the sort of rational assumption that other people are going to help. And I was wondering, today, everyone has cell phones, or many more people. So do you think the existence of this technology, which more abstractly, I would say, lowering the cost of helping would increase helping? Since when people are sort of in this paralysis, as you describe it, presumably taking action might seem very costly to them. Like I have to go to call the police or go to my room to get use my landline. But if their cell phone is right there, they could try to film it or something. In other words, would that sort of shake them out of their state of unrealness?
So that's a fantastic question, and I'm really glad that you asked that. To answer, I'd really like to share my screen once more to show you guys an image. I wasn't sure if I should include it, but I'm seeing now that it's a good idea. So let me just show you this. So this is actually I guess a political cartoon, an activist cartoon by Eric Alley. And this is an obvious reference to the Kitty Genovese murder in the era of smartphones. And if you can see here, the joke being made, or the dig being made by this artist, is that instead of actually doing something, these people here are hashtagging about it. And of course, this is meant to be satire, but I think there is a really important point being made here, which is, I think, I don't necessarily think that technology creates different people. I think technology maybe creates different perceptions of what's possible, but not necessarily better, more civic-minded people. I think in many cases, we think that activism is occurring when it's actually not occurring. I don't know if you've heard the term Slacktivism, but that is a term that's commonly used to refer to pseudo social justice movements. If you remember the Coney 2012 crisis, a lot of people were, I'm going to stop screen sharing, a lot of people were posting and sharing and changing their Facebook profile pictures to raise awareness about a war criminal, essentially, who was training young children to fight and who was, being looked for by international police and human rights committees. And he was never found, but a lot of people around the world felt as though they were contributing to this cause by acting on social media. And many times, these types of activities can actually be helpful if you're posting about a social movement that people can march for, vote for, donate money for. Ironically, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge was actually a much better example of a social media protest. The Black Lives Matter movement obviously was another hugely beneficially promoted cause through social media. But with Coney 2012 specifically, nothing was really achieved by changing one's status. I mean, the police didn't not know what Coney looked like. And then upon seeing, Joni from work's profile picture, all of a sudden they can recognize him on the street. It wasn't exactly as helpful as people wanted to feel. And I think that what can sometimes happen is, if you know anything about catharsis or Freud's theory of catharsis, there's a sense of purging a drive so that it no longer propels us. And if we have the sense of feeling productive or feeling like an activist, right? There's a lot of sort of fake activists during every cause that sometimes want to outwardly project activism, right? This could even be someone who's not really involved in a civil rights movement, changing their status in a sort of ineffectual way to put out an image of being active that might actually purge this person's drive to do anything further that could actually help. So I could only hope that in the age of iPhones, we remember that they're there, but we do need to understand that, firstly, unless we're going to use it to call someone to actually help or to donate money to an effective cause, right, which this conference talks a lot about, simply posting about it won't necessarily get the job done. And people in their apartments definitely had landlines, and no one would personally have been at risk to make such a call from their landlines. And that is really important to think about, because in that day and age, someone clearly would have asked, but in the days before phones, what could someone have done short of running out of their apartment and running to the police? Now we have landlines. Why couldn't they have used this incredible, relatively new technology to get help? And the answer is, we can't fix these moments until we address the gaps in human nature. If someone is feeling derealized from a situation, they're not going to recognize a danger or their role in it and their responsibility in it until we can understand why this primitive response might be in the way. So it's a really long-winded way of saying, I would love to say, yes, it would never happen now because we have iPhones, but they had landlines. And I think that this is really more of a physiological and psychological phenomenon rather than due to a shortage of technology.
Thank you very much for the very detailed answer. Now I would go to the Google Doc and start posing the question there. So the first question I see, how could people have a free response to the danger of the situation and simultaneously not acknowledge the danger?
Right. So I would say that this is sort of more akin to surprise. And when we're taken off guard, we can sometimes take a moment to get our bearings, right? If you can imagine, walking into your home, it's been a long day, you're exhausted, you're holding your grocery bags, and you're just expecting to come home to a dimly lit house, to turn on the lights and to collapse onto the couch. And when you arrive, you see 50 of your coworkers and friends jumping out at you. There's a moment where you don't actually know what's happening because your expectations are subverted. And sometimes, if this surprise is a moment of delight, we laugh. It's a punchline of a joke. If it's unpleasant, we can enter a state of shock. And I think that shock is sort of the negative flip side of surprise that can lead to a moment's delay in deciding what's happening and how we should react to it. And depending on the level of trauma involved in what we're witnessing, that level of shock can absolutely prompt an evolutionary response of both approach and avoid while we're making a decision. And the result of this tug of war over our motivation is the freeze response. It's not necessarily its own third response. It's sort of the result of a stalemate between the two. And these responses are always pushing and pulling us when our hindbrain is sort of kicked into overdrive. And I think that this definitely would be a situation in which we feel this visceral desire to both approach and not to approach. And then it's up to our ability to make sense of what's happening that might decide which one takes over. So I think sometimes it's a desire to believe that what we're perceiving isn't real. It's also looking to others to gauge if the danger that we feel is real. But the freeze response, as I've said before, isn't the result of, a T-chart of a debate about whether or not it's real. The freeze response is instantaneous. It's a reflex. It's being triggered from the hindbrain as quickly as hunger, thirst, and fear. So whether or not we tell ourselves one thing about a situation, or we look to cues to feel one way about a situation, the freeze response would already have kicked into gear. So it's not necessarily that they're happening at the same time. It's back to that diagram where the freeze response actually happens first. And then we look to our situation to gauge. This is just my theory, although there is research supporting that bystander inaction is actually the product of freeze. But the other stages of the process are speculation.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, how much and when should we rely on others to use as a cue for learning?
What a phenomenal question. I want to say never. I think that we absolutely are in some ways always going to be that baby crossing that visual cliff, looking to, others to gauge if what we're seeing is real, if something is dangerous, especially as we're kids. I mean, this is something that is common to all species in the animal kingdom. We are always looking to our peers. Monkeys do, people do, baby birds, like we learn about our whole environment from people who are older than us, people around us, our peer group as well. And I think it really depends on the seniority of the person, because sometimes, peer pressure resulting from learning values and checking our perception of reality from our peers, I mean, it can be sometimes the blind leading the blind. But at the same time, simply relying on someone who's older with authority isn't necessarily safe either. If we've learned anything from the Milgram experiment, where a bunch of people followed simply a Confederate in a lab coat, asking them to do what they thought was providing electrical shocks to someone simply for getting a trivia question wrong. So there's a lot of problems with looking to others for cues, but we can't avoid the fact that it's programmed into our evolutionary DNA to at least look for input. But I think rather than let that be the full stop process of how we gauge a reality, we can't help the fact that it happens at all, but maybe taking it with a grain of salt and realizing that sometimes other people are just as subject to doubt and insecurity, regardless of their age, regardless of their authority in the situation, as we are. So to maybe look around, to maybe bring that information into as one slice of the pie of your perception of what's happening, but not to let it single-handedly sway you one way or the other, because sometimes everyone in a situation can still make the wrong choice. And there were a lot of bystanders involved, as Dr. Staub would say, in the Holocaust. And it takes sometimes a Maria, the woman who sheltered him, to inspire others to do the same and to rise above the crowds.
Okay, thank you again. now the next question. Is this a similar mechanism to what happens during gaslighting in abusive relationships? Would investigating this also provide clues for how to help victims perceive reality and accept their responsibility for finding help or leaving the situation?
That's also a phenomenal question. Wow, what an amazing direction to take this. Yes, I think in some ways, if the abuse that someone is receiving as a victim is particularly traumatic, they might experience a derealization, a depersonalization of self, and split both into the victim and to a passive bystander of the abuse that they're receiving. I think that's very possible. Further research would definitely be required, non-experimental, one hopes, to learn more about this. But absolutely, I think recognizing oneself as a victim is just as critical as being able to recognize someone else. And gaslighting, when you live with someone, especially during COVID, rates of intimate partner violence have absolutely skyrocketed, unfortunately. And I think that especially if we're in an enclosed space with someone who is our only source of social learning, to not have your perception of reality be validated by that person can cause a lot of doubt in people who are insecure. And people in victimized relationships are absolutely conditioned to become insecure. So yes, what a fantastic question. Yes, they would be very vulnerable to that as well. And it would be extremely helpful in an applied sense to provide training to recognize when someone is being gaslit and victimized.
Okay, thank you again for the reply. I think these were all the questions. I have a comment on the Kitty Genovese murder that says there are major inaccuracy of the reporting. I would just say, what is
this is true. There has been debate about, firstly, whether 37 people were completely immobile, or whether there was one man who I think was with his son at the time, and he wanted to call the cops, and he eventually tried. And one other person shouted from their window, "Hey, leave that woman alone." So the common story is that no one acted, and surely it was very unusual for this amount of laxity to occur. But eventually people can snap out of this state. So a lot about this event, namely the fact that it began in broad daylight in the courtyard, even if it was a series of attacks. In the first image, I showed a picture of the newspaper, and the sites were numbered. So the attacks began in broad daylight, and then they persisted when, trigger warning, when Kitty ran to the back of the building, and that is where the murder and rape finished. But this all began in broad daylight, in plain sight of the witnesses there. And even if someone were to call out loud, the police were not called, and no substantial action was taken for the half hour. And it was relatively clear what was going on. So in that sense, I will say that the inaccuracies have been noted. Yes, it did take place in the AMs, but the witnesses who are identified as having seen were awake, and their ears were working, and they were by their windows. So that's one element. But yes, someone did say, "Leave that girl alone." And someone did eventually call the police. And another important inaccuracy to note is that it's commonly left out. It's more of an omission, but Kitty was actually known in the neighborhood to have been lesbian. And it's possible that, as subsequent studies have shown, when the victim is an out-group member, that can further decrease bystanders' willingness to get involved. So there definitely could have been a political factor in the event. But what's important to understand is this case serves as a very helpful parable, and many experimental follow-ups have actually confirmed that we do look to others to understand whether a danger is occurring. And it's still very important to continue with bystander training rather than to single Kitty out. I think that's actually part of the problem, is ruling out a case that could be a really useful tool for learning and altruistic training. But thank you. It's really important to say, and I'm glad that that was brought up.
Definitely interesting. So our session is now officially over. We have a 10 minutes break until the next session on cooperation. I feel if you want, everyone is welcome to stay here. And if Julia is also okay with that, we can continue talking for the next 10 minutes. Otherwise, feel free to leave and grab something to drink or whatsoever.
Absolutely. I can hang around for sure until the next event. And I can drop my email in the chat.
Yes, cool.
Great. Okay, yes.
So I think Peter has another question. I will unmute you.
Yeah, I mean, it was really fascinating. I mean, I'm trying to think about other areas where this kind of phenomena would happen. Like you said, I like the way you frame surprise and its negative being sort of shock, and how I was thinking how some people like surprises and some people don't, you know, and the idea that you're paralyzed and you're trying to make sense of what's going on. And I agree with you that social learning, while I think it's evolutionarily adaptive, today, because of the viral nature again of social media, can be very unreliable and amplified very quickly. So I was trying to think, because the phenomenon I think you're describing is quite general, and this sort of paralysis of not being sure what's happening, and therefore not wanting to do something because you're not sure whether what you think is happening is real or how you're interpreting the world is real. Have you thought about that?
About its more general applications?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's my hope that the theory was general enough that it could apply to a wide variety of situations. I had a longer version of the diagram. If I can, yeah, I'm going to go back to that actually, if I can. Portion of the screen. All right, let's bring this diagram back. So at the bottom here we have a loop, right, at cognitive dissonance, which leads to some sort of rationalizing assumption that, you know, eases the psychological tension. And then easing that psychological tension can then prolong inaction, right? And that cycle can be self-perpetuating once inaction has already been triggered. And I think that a huge factor in whether this process ends up this way is depending on what happens as a result of the reality testing. And I think that if, let's say, you're at a situation where there is a lifeguard present who knows, as James Norris pointed out, that we are trained to single out people, to identify them, that can bring them back into their sense of self, and then they perceive the situation differently. The danger has been confirmed by another pair of eyes, and the process would go very differently from there. And as well, this situation was contingent on the fact that the freeze response would begin with at all. And the freeze response is really dependent on the trauma of the situation. It has to be really a surprise of one's expectations. Whereas if, let's say, you had a friend and you knew that they were going to do something, you might not experience the freeze response that could then lead to such a level of surprise that you might feel derealized. So this process was catered to the Kitty case, but definitely applicable to other situations. I would also venture to say that depending on the type of situation that each witness or bystander is in, if they're in, let's say, a solo apartment, as for the most part was the case with Kitty's witnesses, or if they're in a room with others present, which was the case for most of the experimental follow-up studies, that might also have a huge impact on the actual mental experience. So instead of derealization, where someone looking through a window might feel as though they don't really exist as anything other than a voyeuristic pair of eyes without the power to act in a situation, what might happen instead is actually de-individuation, which is the process of losing your identity to a crowd. But as I've said before, Kitty's witnesses were not in a crowd. They couldn't necessarily exchange glances with each other. But if one was in a crowd, this has definitely been shown to be a phenomenon that occurs. It's definitely been brought up in Zimbardo's infamous prison experiment, which of course has its own methodological issues, and many other studies where the individual identity of each person in a group was lost in favor of a group identity, maybe even temporarily. But this process can even be a good thing. If a bunch of people are in uniform, they can de-individuate, meaning, trade in their individual identity temporarily for a group one. And if that group identity is a pro-social one, it will impact their behavior in a pro-social way. Of course, mobs and anonymous communities, as we know, can also lead to the worst side of humanity, where we de-individuate, we shed our individual identity, and we don, let's say, a mob that can cause harm, that can hide in the corners of anonymity and bully someone or cause damage to property, to people, to life. All of these things can absolutely occur as well. So I think a huge part of it is, as part of this branching diagram, how traumatic the event is, whether the person is in isolation or not, the nature of the group that the person is in, and whether the identity of the group is positive or negative, as well as whether anything happens to bring that person out of this derealized or de-individuated state back into their own sense of self with a moral responsibility to help. So this would be a very complicated branching diagram. I did plan it all out one time, but I just wanted to take the branch that would be the most relevant and easiest to digest today. But yes, thank you for asking. And I hope that it would be able theoretically to cover a wide variety of situations.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? I mean, so that's fascinating. In that diagram, you mentioned in your talk how, from cognitive dissonance theory, it's well known that if there's a disconnect between your beliefs and your action, it's much more, I forget, I'm familiar with cognitive dissonance, but I guess is what you said, that it's much more likely, or?
It's both more likely and less embarrassing. And it eases the tension the fastest to change your own beliefs, because it's a quicker process than undoing, apologizing for, justifying, reversing your actions. And that could also cause, a loss of face, right? So to change your internal beliefs so that you can either justify why the contradiction isn't a true contradiction, or why you never believed what you might have believed to begin with at all. Got it.
So the belief changes faster, lower cost, and sort of preserves your self-identity.
Lower social cost for sure, and it preserves your social identity, absolutely. And even though being alone in your apartment, your actions aren't necessarily public, they definitely were when the press would start interviewing each of the witnesses and asking them, why did you do nothing? Where were you? What were you thinking? It wouldn't really make sense to say, well, I had an out-of-body experience, actually, and I doubted whether my world was real, because I was looking out a window and I felt as though I was in a VR game, even if that's what might have been happening on a subconscious level.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sticking around and answering the additional questions. I think this topic is really interesting and highly relevant.
Thank you so much. I dropped my email.
Thank you.